Plate. I'm Professor of Culture and Inclusivity and Director of Radboud Institute for Culture and History. And I'm delighted to welcome you here on behalf of Radboud University. To welcome you to this opening act, this warm act for the featured act that brings us all together here. Professor Brigitte Adriaan's inaugural lecture later this afternoon. Welcome especially to our special guests. Their Excellencies, the ambassadors of Bolivia to the Netherlands, the ambassadors of Dominican Republic, and the embassy of El Salvador, and of course Professor Herman Herlinghaus from the University of Freiburg. I'm delighted to welcome you here and open the symposium on the occasion of Professor Adriaan's inaugural at Radboud University because it allows me to formally launch this marvelous project on which she is embarking, and for which she recruited so many wonderful people to join her in this venture. This project, we all know here, is highly original and innovative and bound to have a huge impact, socially and academically. From a look at the symposium's program, I trust the interdisciplinary character will come to the fore in the interdisciplinary dialogue stage this afternoon, as well its relevance and urgency. I'm delighted to have been invited to welcome you here today, because it also allows me to express my thanks to Professor Adriaanse for bringing yet again a marvelous project to our faculty and research institute. Already with her VD project on the politics of irony in contemporary Latin American literature on violence, she was at the forefront of new developments in the study of Latin American literature, being one of the first scholars to discuss irony and violence together and daring to bring the idea of humor in these contexts. With a new project, Medicine, Poison and Magic Potion, she breaks further intellectual scholarly ground by extending her expertise to the study of the perception of drugs in different societal domains. We gratefully acknowledge that as part of the Medicine, Poison and Magic Potion project, this symposium is financed by the Dutch Research Council. Brigitte, congratulations again. I wish you lots of inspiring and stimulating discussions with your research group and beyond, and look forward to all that is to come today and in the days and years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ilke Plate, for this very kind introduction, and I should say this symposium is not only financed by NWO, but also by the Rich Research Institute, you forgot to mention. So thank you for that. And welcome to all of you. I'm really very happy to see so many of you today. And I welcome especially the ambassadors of Bolivia, República Dominicana, El Salvador, and also our keynote speakers, and all of you who will be participating in the discussion. So thank you for being here. So, what are we going to do today? You might be asking yourself. This interdisciplinary... Oh, that's not my presentation. Okay, I won't use the presentation. This interdisciplinary symposium on poison medicine or magic potion is related to this research project that we are working on with a whole team today. And in the faculty, it's known as the drugs project. So if someone new is arriving, like Nidia arrived only 2 weeks ago, the first question they receive is like, are you on drugs? And then they say, yes, I am, or they say, no, I'm on another project. But so what is drugs and why are we talking about drugs? Because actually it's not the best term we wanted to use, but when you want to convince a scientific committee of the sense of your research, in the Netherlands at least, you need to use understandable terms like drugs. But actually we prefer a different term, which is the pharmacon. And the pharmacon is a term that was introduced, and I'm looking at Herman. The pharmacon is a concept which is used by different philosophers like Plato, like Jacques Derrida, and like Herman Herlinghaus, to actually explain that drugs is not a scientific concept. Drugs is not something we can easily define. It changes, the meaning of what drugs are change depending on the time where we live, or on the culture where we are, or on the subculture in which we are, of which we are part. So drugs is a very movable and changing concept, and if we talk about the pharmacon instead, we can indicate that drugs can mean both poison or medicine or magic potion, according to who is talking, actually. And that's what we want to do today. We want to research with you, investigate, dialogue, converse on the different meanings of this word drugs, and we will start from this idea that actually this is a pharmacon, so that the concept is changing continuously according to which discourse and who is talking. And that this meaning of what drugs are also changes continuously. And that it's very important to understand that we, as the humanities, have a big role to play here, because we think that if we understand to what extent the meaning of drugs is a pharmacon, is a very ambiguous and complex concept, we can understand that cultural perception actually is very important and influences policy a lot, because the rules about what we call drugs are also very much dependent on how we perceive these plants or these substances. So policy depends on cultural perception and the other way around. Cultural perception also depends on policy, so the policy that is in place also in turn influences how we look at these plants. So this is actually what we would like to discuss with you today, how these concepts shift continuously, change continuously, and you will see in one lecture, the first lecture by the ambassador Roberto Calzadilla, how he discusses that the coca leaf, for example, has been considered as a poison within contemporary prohibition and legislation. The same topic will be discussed by Nidia Olvera and Ana Camacho, who will be discussing peyote, and who will be discussing the concept of cultural heritage as a concept and as a category that might help us to understand better how to deal with these plants in a context of prohibition. Some other disciplines are looking at ayahuasca, for example, from a medical perspective. So Kim van Oorsouw, who is joining us from Maastricht, will explain to what extent, for example, ayahuasca is also seen as a medicine, right, within therapy, and what are the consequences of this perspective, medical perspective on the plant. And in the last place, we will also discuss with Tom Sintobin and Christian Thiem the role of these plants, these psychoactive plants, within tourism, where often tourists will have an idealized, romanticized, exoticized image of indigenous cultures, and will rather see the plant as a magic potion or some very exotic brewish, right? So you will see in the different discussions how this concept continuously shifts, and Herman certainly will delve much deeper into it than I can do now. So just to give you this idea, that's what we're trying to do today, and then I just have only one more very small practical comment. We will be taking some pictures for our social media, but we will make sure that you're not recognizable, so I hope that's okay for all of you. We will not put you in the picture, it's rather the speakers here who will be in the picture. So that was actually the outline I wanted just to draw a little bit, and then I just don't think I need to say anything else, Bibi? No? Okay. Bibi is the big head and the hard disk of our heads, so she has been organizing everything. Thank you, Bibi, for this. So I think that's mainly what I wanted to say. Thank you all for being here. Then I now give the floor to Luis Miguel Rojas Bercia, who is our freshly appointed assistant professor in linguistics. He's a specialist in indigenous languages and speaks many of them. So he will introduce you to the ambassador Roberto Calzadilla. Thank you.
So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I have the honor of being the bad guy today and moderating the first table. So I have the honor as well of presenting His Excellency Roberto Calzadilla, Ambassador of the plurinational state of Bolivia, to the Netherlands. His work has touched upon crucial topics such as crimes against humans, the valorization or revalorization of non-Western traditions, and most crucially, the decolonization and declassification of the coca leaf as a narcotic drug. Today, we have the honor of his presence, representing a crucial political partaker in this process, as well as being himself an individual coming from a non-Western but Andean paradigm. At the same time, I have the honor of presenting Professor Dr. Wil Pansters as the respondent. Professor Pansters holds Chair of Social and Political Anthropology of Latin America at Utrecht University. He has focused on understanding the historical panorama of drug trafficking in Latin America, and as I said, he will join us as a responder later on after His Excellency Roberto Calzadilla's talk. So I invite His Excellency to join us, so the floor is all yours.
Well, good afternoon to everyone. Especially I would like to greet Lidike Plake. Dr. Lidike is the director here of Institute and History of the University of Radboud. So thank you for opening this university for such an interesting project about this main investigation led by Dr. Brigitte Andresen, who I would like also thank very much, and also I would like to greet Wil Panster from the University of Utrecht, and as well Herrenhaus from the University of Freiburg in Germany, and some other professors that I don't have the name. I would like also especially underline and greet the ambassador of the Republic of Dominican Republic, who is here today with us, as well the Chargé d'Affaires of El Salvador, who is also here, and also all you. Great to see you all with great interest to this topic that brings us today. So my presentation will be about the classification of the coca leaf as a narcotic drug. As you can see, the human consumption of the coca leaf that dates back to more than 8,000 years ago, and it's currently consumed around about 10 million in our Andean Amazonian region. Every day, every week, there is a consumption of coca leaf in different contexts, not only in the rural context, in the urban context. It's part of our ritual, it's part of our tradition. For us, the coca leaf is a master plant, a source of knowledge and vital energy. For us, is life. Coca leaf is not a narcotic, not a psychotropic drug, not a poison, rather is a healthy and a superfood, and a sacred medicine. But there are transcendent moments to put it into perspective, the perception of coca leaf as a threat to society. It is therefore important to understand the history and how only 70 years ago came to be considered and confused as a narcotic drug, or as a drug, as Brigitte said before. We found archaeological reference of the coca leaf consumption and uses as a medicine in our millenarian cultures, in the iconography of the ancestral Tiahuanaco culture and the poetry of the Mochica culture. There are many more pre-Columbian historical reference of the coca leaf, pre-Inca, post-Inca, and during the Inca time as well. Its adaptation to the pre-colonial model and the economic and political role it played at the beginning of the 20th century. It's therefore important to understand the history of the events of the 20th century and how only 70 years ago the coca leaf came to be considered and confused and classified as a drug. The United Nations Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs of 1961 was signed by 73 countries and 3 years later entered into force in December 1964, was intended to establish the control of narcotic drugs in the post-war era of the United Nations. The fundamental objective of the 61 Convention on Narcotic Drugs was to control the abuse of narcotic drugs and not to prohibit medical uses and sociocultural practices that do not harm health, as stated in the preamble and Articles 1, 2, 4 and 21 of the Convention. The 61 Single Convention, as is more common known, listed coca leaf as a narcotic drug in Schedule 1, which are the substances that are highly addictive and highly liable to abuse based upon this judgment, and it also called for the abolition of coca chewing, as it's called, the traditional use of coca leaf, representing a grave historical error with severe social impacts and infringements on indigenous and cultural rights. Although embedded in the medicinal, nutritional, social, cultural and religious practice of the Andean and Amazonian population, all signatories were obliged to phase out its usage by the Article 49(2), in which it stated coca leaf chewing must be abolished within the 25 years from the coming into force of this convention. It was based on the conclusion of the World Health Organization Expert Committee on Drug Dependency in 52 and 54 that coca chewing was a form of addiction and cocainism. The only background document used for this assessment was the contested 1950 report undertaken by the UN Commission of Inquiry of the coca leaf containing serious scientific fallacies. The UN report and the World Health Organization position in the 50s and early 60s corresponds to a colonial view of prejudice towards indigenous peoples and their cultural practices that existed at the time and permeated the international drug control system, which is called the Vienna Consensus, based on the 61 Convention, the 71 Convention that we are going to talk later, and also the 88 Convention on trafficking on narcotics and psychotropic substances. So the purpose of the UN Commission in the 50s had been to establish the harms inflicted by coca chewing, which concluded these studies that coca chewing does not constitute an addiction, a toxicomania, but rather a habit. And although it has all the characteristics of a habit, no abstinence symptoms are seen. At the same time, the report claims coca is the cause of malnutrition of indigenous population, the cause to reduce economic performance of those consuming coca. Coca was thus held responsible for keeping the indigenous population in poor economic condition. While the report contains a number of testimonials of local physicians in Peru and Bolivia who describe coca as non-problematic and even beneficial, most of the report's description of indigenous behavior and custom would nowadays be classified as biased, racist and ethnocentric, and as such quite unacceptable in a scientific, from a perspective from the science. In addition, coca usage was viewed exclusively from a very limited pharmacological and physiological perspective, not taking into account or valuing its cultural significance and nutritional and health benefits. Bolivia and Peru questioned the result of this report in the 50s and requested more studies. The responsibility for this historical error, therefore, lies within the World Health Organization itself. The international community had entrusted the World Health Organization with making conclusive assessment of the health impacts of psychoactive substances, which were supposed to be based on clear scientific evidence. Without the conclusion presented by the World Health Organization, the parties, the state members of the 61 Convention, would not have decided to add coca leaf to Schedule 1, and which required that coca chewing was also abolished. Since then, there has been no official coca leaf chewing by the World Health Organization. In 1992, the Expert Committee on Drug Dependency of the World Health Organization considered that the properties of coca leaf, its social role and health consequences of its use should be studied, implicitly acknowledging the weak evidence based on previous conclusion in the 50s. The committee concluded nevertheless that coca leaf was an appropriated schedule, but only on the basis that cocaine is readily extractable from the leaf. This change of the justification for maintaining the scheduling of coca leaf as a narcotic drug from its similarity to cocaine and convertibility was made without a proper review and any allegation. The decision conflates the concept of convertibility and extraction without any further explanation, and it's inconsistent with other plants and raw materials like poppy straw, which remained unscheduled and dealt within the single convention. The health impacts of coca chewing and the potential benefits of coca leaf have never been officially examined by the United Nations, while perceived negative effects were asserted without an epidemiological evidence of clinical trials exposing the lack of legitimacy of its current classification. The only research undertaking was in 1992-95 in the context of the World Health Organization UNICITRI. It was called the Cocaine Project, which concluded that traditional use of coca appears to have no negative health effects and that it serves positive therapeutic, sacred and social functions among indigenous groups in the Andean region. The official publication of this study was impounded under political pressure of the United States, and its results were never published. Bolivia, Peru, Colombia and Argentina have all in different occasions in recent decades already challenged the condemnation of the coca leaf by means of treaty reservation provision in their own constitution or domestic law, but could not change the actual classification and prohibition of the traditional uses as stated in the convention. Millions of people in these countries are using coca leaf on a daily basis without experiencing any negative effects. For many indigenous peoples in the region, the coca leaf represents an essential element in their cultural, ceremonial, traditional medicinal practices. The use of and consumption of coca leaf does not produce any psychological or physical changes greater than those resulting from the consumption of other plants like coffee, tea, or other vegetable material and products of free and universal use. Bolivia initially didn't become party of the 61 Convention and only signed in 1976 during the brutal military dictatorship of General Banzer, and without any reservation. Argentina and Peru, both with also significant coca chewing populations, were the only countries to deposit a reservation upon signing the convention, but Peru withdrew its reservation when ratifying the treaty in 1964, and Argentina military regime withdrew its reservation in 1979. So you see how politics interfere in the judgment of these substances as well. 15 years ago, in March 2009, Bolivia requested an amendment to the 61 Convention, with the proposal to delete the obligation of Article 49 that coca leaf chewing must be abolished. The article originally allowed countries a temporary exception of this measure, but coca chewing had to be phased out in any case within 55 years, a period which expired at the end of '89. Bolivia request would have been approved automatically, but 17 countries of the so-called Friends of the Convention, the fundamentalists, led by the United States, opposed the amendment and prevented this from happening. No formal decision, however, has been reached yet about this amendment proposal, which requires, of course, a decision of the ECOSOC. But a next step that Bolivia was bringing in the international as an amendment, because in 2009 Bolivia changed being from a republic to convert itself to a plurinational state of Bolivia, in which we recognize different rights of more than 36 indigenous nations that Bolivia has. We recognize their languages, we recognize their traditions, their medicine, so it's incorporated in a new constitution, which also recognizes the rights of Pachamama. And one of the provisions of our new constitution also provides the defending our patrimony, which is part of our biodiversity, like coca leaf. And in order to bring this national law, our constitution, in line with our international obligation, in June 2011, Bolivia withdrew from the single convention by presenting the UN General Secretary a notification, and Bolivia reacceded later on in 2012 with its reservation, which you can read here. The plurinational state of Bolivia reserves the right to allow in its territory traditional coca leaf chewing, the consumption and use of the coca leaf in its natural state for cultural, medicinal purposes, such as the use of infusion, and also the cultivation, trade and possession of coca leaf to the extent necessary for these illicit purposes. That's the basis of our reserve. In total, 169 states accepted, and only 14 countries have objected Bolivia's reaccession with its reservation, and since that number fell far short of the required minimum on the 1/3 of treaty parties to invalidate, the Secretary General declared that it should be permitted. 2 more countries has recently accepted Bolivia's reservation, among them Mexico and the Netherlands only 1 month ago, which also makes us very happy. Their right to maintain these practices firmly, the right of the indigenous populations and the right of Bolivians to maintain these practices firmly established in international human rights law, particularly in the International Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the ILO Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The last one states that indigenous peoples have the right to maintain, control, protect and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge and their cultural expression, manifestation, science, technology, including their human and animal genetic resources, seeds, medicines, knowledge of the properties of flora and fauna. And more recently, these rights has been reaffirmed by the Forum of Indigenous Issues, and also, among others, in different General Assembly resolutions. The World Health Organization guidance clearly states that the critical review is immediately initiated when there has been a notification from a party to the convention concerning the scheduling of substances, because we made the first step defending the right to use and to chew coca in Bolivia, but still the convention is challenging, and therefore Bolivia is today asking for a rescheduling of the coca leaf in the convention. Recently, in June 2003, the plurinational state of Bolivia has notified and requested to activate the process of critical review of the classification of coca leaf as a narcotic drug in the Scale 1 in accordance to Article 3 of the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. We are requesting that the technical scientific body of the World Health Organization and its expert committee on drug dependency reassess with the aim of correcting this historical gap in the control regime for drugs and their derivatives be activated. To this end, we have presented a dossier of objective substantiation and allegations for overcoming the aspects of these inconsistencies linked to the typification and classification of coca leaf in the context of the international legal framework. Finally, it is important to clarify that initiating this critical review of the coca leaf intends to rectify this colonial and historical error, reassessing the plant's property in the light of the latest scientific evidence and improving the consistency of the treaty system with respect to the control of plantal material, precursors, preparation and extracted alkaloids. Revising the classification of the coca leaf as a narcotic drug would resolve a long-standing legal contradiction and inconsistencies and decriminalization of widespread indigenous cultural and traditional medical practices and allow the indigenous community to benefit from the use of coca leaf in its natural form. The intention of Bolivia is not to lessen international control of the cultivation of coca and the use of coca leaves for the illicit production of cocaine. Those control provisions are embedded in the specific articles of the 61 that we are not questioning, and 61 and 88 convention, but which will still remain in force when the coca leaf is no longer classified as a narcotic drug itself and it's deleted from the scheduling. Finally, I would like just to thank very much for your attention. I think we are going to have now some dialogue on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I invite Professor Ansters.
Thank you very much, Brigitte and others from the Institute, for the kind invitation to respond to these wise words. Your Excellency, thank you very much for your analysis of the coca leaf from both a legal, cultural and international relations perspective that has stressed Bolivia's critical role during many years in reframing the discussion. Please allow me some comments and questions. First, some years ago, and an anecdote, when I was teaching about drug trafficking in Latin America, I used to show my students a short video of your former President Evo Morales giving a speech at the UN Narcotic Drugs Commission in Vienna in 2009. He talks about as well the historic error of the 1961 convention and stresses and gives example of his personal experiences the cultural and medicinal meanings of coca leaves. For many students, that was an eye-opener, that short video, and I think that your detailed reconstruction of today will achieve the same here. Second, at the heart of your presentation, from a more scholarly perspective, lie the relationships between legal and scientific discourses about particular plants and their links to narcotic and dangerous drugs, as the predecessor of the DEA was once called at the end of the 1960s, on the one hand, and the cultural and popular meanings and narratives on the other hand. Your reflections, which I find very interesting, on the contradictions between international drugs regime, legal regimes on the one hand, and the rights of indigenous communities that has emerged in recent decades, are very insightful. In scholarly terms, again, the key element here is a constructivist view or a constructivist approach to drug-related narratives and policies, which carry many controversial meanings. You have mentioned the colonial and the racial prejudices among them. Such an approach reveals how certain drug discourses even can trump, and they still continue to do so, scientific evidence, right? As if they don't matter. So, medicinal or biological scientific evidence. As we know, prohibitionist and repressive supply-side policies stubbornly persist. I refer, presidential candidate DeSantis has vowed to send special forces into Mexico to confront drug cartels. The war on drug narratives, the war on drugs narrative has deadly consequences, as we know. I therefore congratulate Brigitte Adriaans with her research project about the cultural practices and mythologies concerning drugs and plants and all that is related to this in Latin America. Third, your analysis of the coca leaf has actually an interesting prehistory. The description of the framing of the coca leaves reminds me a lot of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics Director Harry Anslinger framing of marijuana in the 1930s. In fact, concocting a moral panic around the crime and violence related to marijuana consumption, the so-called alleged connection. Anslinger's narrative has remained influential for many decades and actually functioned as one of the foundational pieces of prohibitionist policies. It also contained clear racist elements and ignored scientific evidence, many parallels 30 years before. Fourth, having said all that, things are never that black and white either. I give you an example. In the 1930s, a man was arrested in the northern Mexican town of Ciudad Juarez at the train station in the possession of several kilos of marijuana he was carrying with him. He claimed that it was for personal use, since he suffered from rheumatoid arthritis, which may have been the case. At the time, Mexicans indeed used marijuana soaked in alcohol as medicine. This may have been the case as well in this person's occasion. But, yes, but it is also very likely that this man intended to sell part of his load to local and US consumers in Juarez's flourishing nightlife drug economy, which, by the way, was managed by a woman called La Nacha. Well, medicinal use of marijuana or coca leaf, for that matter, can easily coexist, that's my point, with selling the product on the drug market as well. So how does the distinction between the coca leaf as an essential element in, and I quote from your text, the cultural, ceremonial and traditional medicinal practices of indigenous communities in Bolivia, and the coca leaf as somehow a primary material for the production of cocaine look like from the local level? My last example. Anthropologist Thomas Grisafis recounts how in the Chapare he was helping a coca farmer planting the coca plant. During a break, while chewing on some leaves, his friend, the Bolivian friend, joked about Grisafis, the researcher, t-shirt that read, "Coca no es cocaína." And the Bolivian friend said, "Well, sometimes it is. Actually, coca usually is cocaine." Come on, Thomas, where do you think all the coca really goes to? Do you think people chew all this, what we are producing here? All this goes to, as he said, La Fábrica Blanca, the white factory. The author concludes, while coca farmers' unions cannot, and we all agree, and should not be thought of as criminal organizations, they nevertheless unwittingly sometimes facilitate the illegal trade. What do you know, or what can we say about how indigenous and mestizo communities in Bolivia actually experience and evaluate and navigate the policy of coca sí and cocaína no? But that was my basic question. Thank you. And apologies for
Well, thank you, Will, for your provocative thoughts that you have presented. Replying to you, I would say, yes, we have to see that 100 years ago, and the Netherlands was the main producer of cocaine in the world. The coca leaf came to a first wave of industrialization when the cocaine was not considered a drug up to the 30s, shortly after the World War. We forget this perspective to see that alcohol and also cocaine became rather later on this prohibition paradigm. We have to see how there is another example, quite interesting. The World Health Organization considered a certain time, because there were other global interests and companies, that tobacco was rather healthy for human consumption. Nowadays, hear what they are saying. We heard 2 days ago the speech of the throne of William Alexander, who said in 10 years the tobacco smoking will be wiped out from the Netherlands. This is a political perspective, a society, and this is a proposal, and perhaps there has a lot of consensus nowadays about what is healthy and what is not healthy. But I think the prohibitionist paradigm, of course, comes with a certain interest. We saw how the 61 Convention allowed the production of the flavor agent of coca for the production of cocaine. So it was like tailor-made, this convention, for certain interests, specific interests, and not for traditional uses, because these rights were not recognized. In social rights and these cultural rights is something that we have to fight today for its recognition. But certainly we have to see that the perception and the different narratives of policies change. Certainly in Bolivia you see coca chewing, and you will see that this person who is chewing, I was chewing early when I had my military service. It's not considered as such. It's like drinking a coffee or drinking a tea. Today we have, of course, in the name of the fight and the prohibition of cocaine, we are sacrificing at the same time the traditional uses of a very medicinal and health contribution of nature to the humankind. So I think there are many things that are not black and white, but we have to reassess, to reapproach, and I think this is also the seminar aim, to see, okay, where are we, and how is our society putting things black and white, and today is something correct and tomorrow it's not correct. The same as the case of cannabis. Cannabis is now almost legal, no? Through the different changes that we are following. So society changes as well, and this perspective also changes, but also we are coming from a very long tradition that should be also respected, and also the Western society has imposed many paradigms that not necessarily are objective, scientific, and today this is a fight for us, and this is what we are doing today, because nothing is given to us, so we are trying to fight, even with a progressive position like the Netherlands that opposed our reserve under the argument that the proceeding is not correct. But my time is over and we will still discuss. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Please, I beg all participants to keep silence while we have our presenters disserting. That's not only a matter of respect, but it distracts the other attendants. Thank you so much. Since we have a soundproof room, please, we can listen to all the things you say, so please keep silence.
Thank you, both speakers, for that very thought-provoking conversation. Well, for this conversation we're going to have next, the purpose of it is to discuss the implications of recognizing peyote as cultural heritage of Mexico, considering its legal status, its conditions, and controversy. And for that, we have Lidia Hernandez. She has a PhD in modern contemporary history, and she's currently a postdoctoral researcher here at Radboud University studying peyote. And on her side, we have Ana Laura Camacho. She has a background in heritage studies and a master in art and visual culture. And her PhD research here at Radboud is on the shifting perspectives of peyote in Mexico. So, Nidia, what can you tell us about the historical and cultural importance of peyote?
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Ana, and everyone for being here. So peyote, first to say that it's this plant, it's a Lophophora williamsi. It's a spineless cactus that grows in this area of northern Mexico and southwestern of the United States, and that contains the psychoactive substance mescaline. This cactus has a long history. There are records of its use dating back more than 5,000 years, and it was considered to have a low contact with the divine and was used in religious, ritual, and medicinal practices with pre-conquest societies. When colonizers arrived in the 16th century, practices with peyote and other psychoactive plants were considered idolatrous, related to sorcery and the devil. In 1620, the Holy Inquisition published this is part of the document, the Peyote Edict, that prohibited the uses of this cactus, but this did not prevent indigenous people or other social groups from approaching the plant, and it was reported different uses, for example, as a tonic, to give energy, in ointments against pain, as an amulet in love magic, in rituals to cure various diseases or for divination. By the 19th century, the plant was analyzed by scientists and described by travelers, anthropologists, writers, and artists in Mexico and abroad. For example, in 1913, the National Institute of Medicine in Mexico published this article, titled The Peyote Study, which note that indigenous people apply it externally for snake bites, burns, and rheumatism, and that have effects on the brain. Now, this is another example. And nowadays, peyote is considered sacred among different indigenous groups, such Nayeris, Odam, Raramuris, and Wiraricas. These last ones with an intimate relationship with the cactus and part of the area that its plants grow up, that is called Wirikuta. And because they're like this famous visionary art, this kind of art. And additionally, it's very important in other native peoples in the United States or Canada, like the Native American Church and other cults that uses peyote in their rituals. Just to conclude with this part, it's important to mention that peyote is a plant subject to drug prohibition, like coca. So in 1971, the United Nations Convention on Psychotropic Substances included mescaline, not the plant, just the substance, and in the list of dangerous substances highly subject to abuse. And Mexico signed this convention in 1984 and added the plant, the peyote plant, to the national list of controlled substances. However, it's different in other countries, and this generates some ambiguity about the regulation of this plant. So I want to pass the word to Ana.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also important to mention that peyote has had a very important relevance not only in the Mexican context but also in the Euro-American drug history. It was not only the first psychoactive plant in being forbidden by the Catholic Church, but also the first psychoactive plant, paradoxically, in being studied for medical purposes, just as mescaline was. So even though both mescaline and peyote lost currency in medical discourse towards the 1950s, they remained very much active within the cultural discourses. So within this circle, say, cultural representations such as Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception played a key role in keeping both mescaline and peyote active within the cultural imagination. So recently, peyote has regained the attention of the medical discourse, but not as much as other plants such as mushrooms or the ayahuasca, for instance. But the context in which it has been receiving more and more attention is the religious context, especially among pan-Indianist type of religious groups, and also within the spiritual context, as it is often used in spiritual retreats, which are taking place, of course, in Mexico, but also here in Europe. So what is worrisome is that this plant is under threat because of mining activities which are taking place in the Mexican desert, and also because of this commercial network that we don't really understand very well. And while the fact that it disappears, of course, threatens these contemporary cultural uses, both indigenous and non-indigenous, so it's something to think about.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ana. And have any strategies been implemented to guarantee its conservation?
Yes, first at the international levels, the Indigenous and Tribal People Convention of the International Labour Organization and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People mentioned that the social, cultural, religious and spiritual values and practices of these peoples should be recognized and protected, and have highlighted the importance of work with indigenous communities to guarantee their rights, and this is a step forward to protect the different uses given to the sacred plants like peyote. In Mexico, for example, the Constitution mentioned that it is a country that has a multicultural composition, originally supported by its indigenous people, with a framework of autonomy and self-determination, which includes its cultural practices. That implies that the prohibition of peyote not apply for indigenous people, because the different uses that this population give to peyote are considered part of their traditional practices. But these aspects could be controversial because it is tightly bound up with racial and identity aspects, and with the criminalization of users of these cactus who belong to other social sectors. On the other hand, peyote is the subject of environmental laws, and in Mexico it's considered like a plant that needs a special protection. That means that the state needs to prevent its exploitation and promote its recovery and conservation. Unfortunately, there are not enough studies on current peyote populations or efforts for the implementation of this legislation. And it is also important to highlight that there are some conservation efforts that have been carried out by civil society and academia. For example, this Cactus Conservation Institute based on Texas that works with the Native American shores, a scientific community and regulatory bodies to study and to look for the preservation of this cactus. And this Hablemos del Hickory, that it means like, let's talk about peyote. And it is an intercultural and interdisciplinary group worried about peyote conservation that seek to create the dialogue with indigenous peoples who have traditionally consumed this cactus, and to generate an exchange of ideas for the conservation of the plant and promote rational and sustainable management.
Well, I think it's very interesting to add that on the basis of all these legal considerations Nidia just described, the Mexican state recently, this year, they released a presidential decree to protect the sacred land of 4 different indigenous groups who use peyote. And well, in this document they established that there is the need to protect the land with relation, or in relation to the traditions and practices of indigenous people. Though I have to stress that this document does not specifically mention the use of peyote or protect peyote as a species, but the land in which peyote exists. So because of this specific structure, it really connects with the idea of biocultural heritage, which is a new category of heritage which has been advocated in both academic and activist contexts, although it is not recognized by the United Nations. This concept has been circulating also in the Mexican academia, and what it's interesting is that these scholars have been advocating not just to recognize peyote use as a biocultural heritage of indigenous people, but as a biocultural heritage of also non-indigenous people, which is already a very thought-provoking proposal, in the sense that it opens the space for discussing under which circumstances non-indigenous people could use this plant in addition to indigenous people.
Okay, yeah. And what would it imply? What are the implications of recognizing peyote as cultural heritage?
Well, in order to answer this question, I think it is very important first to discuss what actually biocultural heritage is and where does it come from, right? So this concept was developed during the past decade, and it designates a system composed by the interdependent relationship between cultural practices, indigenous cultural practices, and the territory. So the concept has biological components such as the land, and also biodiversity, and also cultural components such as traditions and specifically knowledges, which are useful for relating with the biodiversity, but in a sustainable way in order to cooperate to the sustainment of local economies. When I say this interdependent relationship, I want to stress the both holistic and the relational nature of this concept, which stands in contrast to the traditional concept of heritage, which encompasses natural and cultural heritage, both tangible and intangible, but it understands these categories as separate categories which do not have a relationship. So this, the classical concept of cultural heritage has been widely criticized as it sort of sustains this Western perspective of what heritage is, in the sense that it fails to recognize that both culture and nature exist in an interdependent relationship and not separately. Well, this failure stems from the fact that it uses authenticity as one of the core values to understand what is heritage and what is not, which is an idea that applies mainly to tangible objects and to the built environment. But when it is applied to the natural environment, it sees it as this pristine nature wilderness where human activity is being seen as damaging the authenticity of it. So as a result, in many occasions, indigenous people and other communities have been expelled from the territories to preserve the authenticity of the land. So another criticism that has been made to this concept is that it fails to acknowledge sustainability and the impact of climate change and the Anthropocene. So this concept of the biocultural heritage addresses these preoccupations for climate change and also for social justice. We can even see it as a decolonial effort to take seriously indigenous knowledges as a role model to try to understand how we should relate to the natural environment. So acknowledging peyote as a biocultural heritage would mean to try to understand the way in which indigenous people relate not only to peyote but also to the land, and to develop our policies in those terms. But it also would imply to stick to the way in which they understand who is entitled to use peyote and under which conditions, which is already, it already introduces certain tension with other groups who are also interested in the use of it, such as the Native American Church and these other pan-Indianist cults that we were talking about, and also people who use it for spiritual purposes.
Okay. Thank you very much, both of you, for this, for lack of a better word, stimulating conversation. And we're moving towards the next dialogue. Okay.
And just before we continue, I'm sorry, hi, I'm Bibi, co-coordinator of the event today, and I would just like to be sure, and so repeat words of my co-colleague Luis Miguel in Spanish. Quisiera pedir a todos, todas y todes que por favor estamos grabando la sesión de hoy, así que les pido por favor que no hablen durante la sesión. Gracias.
Well, now we're moving to our second dialogue, and this one is going to delve on tourism and ayahuasca. For this, we have first Christian Tim. He's a sociocultural anthropologist who has worked in indigenous Shuar communities in southeast Ecuador, and he's currently a postdoctoral researcher here at Radboud University, who's researching the history of intercultural exchanges between Westerners and indigenous Amazonians. And Tom Sintobin, he's working here as an assistant professor in cultural studies at Radboud University, and his research focuses on tourist cultures, regional literature, and artistic representations of minorities. And for this dialogue, I give the floor to Tom. He's going to be guiding the conversation.
Okay, thank you for this invitation. I will ask some questions to Christian and we'll see what happens. The good thing about tourism studies is that whatever word you take and you put the word tourism after it, you have definitely a book on that. Take shopping tourism, food tourism, coffee tourism, chocolate tourism, film tourism, and so on. So today we would like to study ayahuasca tourism. Ayahuasca is at the center, I think, of public conversation nowadays. And if you go to Latin America, to the Amazon basin, there are several resorts, or as you can see from my slide, organic farm and retreats, where you can have ayahuasca experiences. Somebody counted in 2019, and 62,000 people went there to stay for a full week to have ayahuasca experiences. And some of them spend up to $4,000 for just 1 week accommodation and the ritual itself. The capital or the epicenter of ayahuasca tourism is supposed to be Iquitos, the capital of Peru. I'm really fascinated by what has been called the ayahuasca industry, and also about its effects, and also about who are these people. So that's my first question. Who are these ayahuasca tourists? Who are these 62,000 people?
I think it's important to contextualize, having just listened to Roberto Calzadilla, that we're talking about tourism and the Western encounter with a practice, and this is a practice that has actually been going on for centuries at least, right? So when we discuss ayahuasca tourism, this is what Westerners are making of something that has existed for a very long time, right? So we shouldn't have our mindset on ayahuasca tourism as something that's inherent to what ayahuasca is, yeah? We hear some positive stories and negative stories coming out of tourist visits to places like Iquitos, yeah? But there is so much flexibility in terms of what people bring to this experience and what might have been made of it by other people. So let me give you an example. Ayahuasca tourists tend to go to places like Iquitos for this notion of healing, and many people are involved in alternate health scenes, right? The idea that the plant is a medicine in some way that would supersede what we can understand in pharmaceutical medicine, right? So through the ayahuasca experience, people will describe themselves as encountering an inner child, an inner version of themselves, or understanding their own trauma, understanding their personal history better, right? And this is very healing for some people and mirrors what is coming out of psychedelic science in terms of research going on with magic mushrooms, LSD. These things have a long history. And the curious thing about this is that it's not mirrored in many indigenous cultures at all. It's very self-centered. It's very much about digging into oneself and trying to cure the self, right? And this is something that the Western culture is bringing to the plant. There's nothing inherent to ayahuasca that is about digging into trauma, but as Western people, we engage with the plant in this way. So that's the primary motivation right now for this boom in ayahuasca tourism that you've been discussing in places like Iquitos, the alternate health scene, and people who, you know, legitimately have not been able to find a solution to whatever health problem they might have through the Western medical system, right? We shouldn't patronize these kind of processes. People who are seeking something, seeking a solution that they're not able to find within their own culture, will venture out and try and find it somewhere else. But at the same time, bringing the baggage our own notions of what reality is, our own notions of what the other can give us. So all of these ideas are implicated in the movement that you are describing.
Actually, that's very. I'm going to skip a few slides. You just answered my third question. What do ayahuasca tourists want? Maybe it's good to give some background on that. I wanted the million-dollar question in tourism: what do tourists want? If you know the answer to that one, you will be a billionaire in just a week. And one of the founding fathers of tourism studies, Dean McCannell, he came with this book at the end of the 1970s, The Tourist: A New Theory of the Leisure Class. And that was a very influential book, and it tried to understand that phenomenon of the tourist, and it described the tourist as the prototypical modern man or modern person. If you wanted to understand modernity, he claimed, you need to study tourists. And he says, okay, tourism starts from a lack, from the feeling that you miss out on something, that you have lost something. And he connects that with alienation, a very typical Marxist term. People have become alienated from their selves, from their deepest selves, and they try to rediscover what they lost. And they project that on the other with a capital O. And the other is supposed to be stuck in time, is supposed to be some place that is isolated, that was not influenced by modernity to such an extent. So tourism then is like this practice, is like this ritual almost, that people go there to resource themselves, to find themselves in the other. And you can indeed see that happening also in what you were saying. And I have a next question, because it's not just male tourists who do that. Ayahuasca tourism, it's about 50% of them are male and the other are female. So my question to you then is, what are the effects of this, of large numbers of women going to these villages or to these resorts and participating in ayahuasca rituals? It has even been connected to a certain kind of feminism, psychedelic feminism. So my question is then, does and will ayahuasca tourism affect local power dynamics? And I found one picture of a female shaman, because the large majority of them are male. But that's my question. Will this affect, or has this already affected local social structures and hierarchy?
I think it's an optimistic reading of what might be an effect of this process, for sure. It's very true that shamanism in Amazonia, in Western Amazonia, tends to be a male-dominated practice. You might also hear people say that the women who do pursue apprenticeships become the most ferocious shamans that there are. So who knows, right? There is a potential for bringing Western ideas of gender equality through the presence of Western people in these very important spaces by a process of osmosis, let's say. So that's the optimistic reading. On the other hand, I think it would be difficult to presume that there is a strong intercultural exchange happening in these spaces. Indigenous Amazonians have a long history of encountering Western outsiders who bring money and bring some sort of goal, some sort of wish for adventure, some wish to encounter something, as you've said, that can't be found in their home environment. And in my experience, Indigenous Amazonians are very familiar with that and very willing to give people what they want to get out of the experience. So when you're in an ayahuasca retreat in places like Peru and Ecuador, you could very well encounter a shaman who will talk to you about your chakras, talk to you about your trauma, right? And these are not things that are important within indigenous shamanism. It's much more focused around notions of sorcery and things that we find difficult to even accept, let alone inform discussion or policy in a Western context.
We have 2 more minutes.
Okay, then if you had to inform policy on this, because I heard a very famous model from tourism studies that describes the evolution that any tourist resort or destination is supposed to follow, and this is for Acapulco. So it starts with a phase of exploration and early explorers, and then it becomes more and more popular. And what is changing is the amount of involvement of local stakeholders. So the higher up in the model you go, the more people come, and all different types of people with different interests, but also the more money from foreign investors come in, and the higher the impact is upon natural and cultural resources. So if you had to inform policy, where are we with ayahuasca tourism, and what needs to happen to make sure that this doesn't become a very destructive kind of tourism?
I would say that we were in the exploration phase through the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. Psychedelic and hallucinogenic drug enthusiasts kept this alive in the Western cultural imagination. For some reason, in the early 21st century, there was a big boom in interest in this through New Age cultures, alternate health cultures, and that's when it became a huge business, right? From there, where will it go? That's really difficult to say. I think the number one thing in all these contexts is just land rights. I'm aware of indigenous groups who run their own retreats on their land, and in that context, it's a useful way for them to gain access to cash, which they need for things that they can't produce in Amazonia, right? So that's it. On the other hand, if you look at ayahuasca tourism in Iquitos, where there's been genocide from the rubber industry 100 years ago, that has almost cleared a slate for investors to then come in and buy up large amounts of land and run these retreats in a way that's completely abstracted from any social relation with local people. So, you know, it's a really sad thing, but if it can occur within the control of local people, then that's going to be a benefit, because if that's their choice to run this kind of operations, then more power to them.
I read somewhere that in Iquitos the majority of these lodges are owned by foreigners, so the money is going elsewhere and the control of the... So I thank you very much for this talk, and I think we're within the time limit.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much for respecting the time. Thank you, Anna and Nidia too, for the dialogue. And now we can move towards another stimulant. We're having a coffee break, right? So we will be back at 2. Thank you.